If you're studying A-level psychology, subscribe. I'm covering the essential topics across AQA, Edexcel, and OCR on this channel. Think about the most important relationship in your life right now. The person you go to when something goes wrong. The person whose opinion matters most to you. The person whose absence genuinely unsettles you and whose presence makes you feel safe. Now consider this. Psychologists argue that the template for that relationship, the emotional blueprint you're using right now, was set in the first year of your life. Before you could walk, before you could talk, in the months when your world consisted almost entirely of one caregiver and the quality of their response to your needs. That is the claim at the heart of attachment theory, and the experiment that gave us the clearest window into how those early bonds form and differ from one another, the strange situation, is what this video is about. This video is moving from memory into attachment, one of the most important and most personally resonant topics in the entire A-level psychology course. And by the end of this video, you will know the strange situation procedure in precise detail. You'll be able to describe and distinguish all three attachment types clearly, and you will have the evaluative tools to use this study in any exam question across AQA, OCR, and Edexcel. Let's begin. Before we get to Ainsworth and the strange situation, we need to establish what we actually mean by attachment. Because the psychological definition is more precise and more specific than the everyday use of the word. Attachment is a strong, enduring emotional bond between an infant and a caregiver, characterized by four key behaviors. It is not simply a preference for one person over another. It is a deep, reciprocal tie that shapes emotional regulation and social development across the entire lifespan. Here, we identify those four key behaviors clearly, and you need to know all four for your exam. Proximity seeking. The infant actively tries to stay close to the caregiver. They follow them, reach for them, protest when they move away. The drive to maintain physical closeness is one of the clearest observable signs of attachment. Separation distress. Visible upset when the caregiver leaves. This is not simply unhappiness, it is a specific distress response triggered by the absence of this particular person. The infant has formed a specific bond, not a general preference for company. Joy on reunion. This is a positive response when the caregiver returns. The quality of this reunion behaviour, whether the infant seeks comfort and is settled by it or behaves in a more complex and ambivalent way, turns out to be one of the most revealing indicators of attachment quality. And the secure base. The caregiver is used as a safe haven during stress or fear. The attached infant can move out into the world to explore, but periodically returns to the caregiver for reassurance. And this secure base function is essential for healthy cognitive and social development. Here I've included Bowlby's key claim, and it's worth spending a moment just on that. John Bowlby argued in 1969 that attachment is an evolved survival mechanism. Keeping infants physically close to caregivers protects them from predators and environmental dangers. In evolutionary terms, infants who formed strong attachments to caregivers were more likely to survive. This evolutionary argument explains why attachment behaviours are so universal. They appear in every human culture and in many non-human species. It also explains the intensity of separation distress. For a prehistoric infant, separation from the caregiver was genuinely dangerous. So here, the key term to remember is attachment. A strong, enduring emotional bond characterized by proximity seeking, separation distress, joy on reunion, and use of the caregiver as a secure base. You also need to know the word caregiver. This is the person who forms the primary attachment bond with the infant, typically, but not exclusively, the mother. You need to know proximity seeking, the infant's drive to maintain physical closeness to the caregiver. And you need to refer to a secure base, the use of the caregiver as a foundation from which to explore the world safely. To understand why the strange situation was necessary, you need to understand what psychologists already knew about attachment by the time Ainsworth began his work, and crucially, what question remained unanswered. There are 3 landmark studies which set the stage. The first is Harlow, 1958. Harry Harlow conducted a series of experiments with rhesus monkeys that fundamentally changed our understanding of what attachment is actually about. He separated infant monkeys from their mothers and gave them 2 surrogate mothers, one made of wire that provided milk through a bottle, and one made of soft cloth that provided no food at all. Classical learning theory, the dominant explanation of the time, would have predicted that the infants would attach to the wire mother because she provided the food that reduced the primary drive of hunger. And this is called the cupboard love theory of attachment. That is not what happened. The infant monkeys spent most of their time clinging to the cloth mother. They ran to her when frightened. They used her as a secure base for exploration. They only visited the wire monkey mother briefly to feed, and then returned to the cloth mother. Harlow's conclusion was clear and revolutionary. Contact comfort matters more than nourishment in the formation of attachment. Attachment is not simply about who feeds you. It's about warmth, softness, physical comfort, and emotional security. The second landmark study is by Lorenz, 1935. Konrad Lorenz demonstrated imprinting in geese. Geese hatch with a biological readiness to form an attachment to the first moving object they encounter, normally their mother. Lorenz showed this by ensuring he was the first moving object goslings saw after hatching. They followed him everywhere, even flying alongside his rowing boat. The critical finding was the existence of a critical period, a biologically determined window during which imprinting must occur. Outside this window, the capacity gets lost. And this concept of a critical period for attachment formation became central to Bowlby's theory and to the questions Ainsworth was trying to answer. And so the third landmark study is Bowlby, 1969. John Bowlby proposed monotropic theory, the idea that infants are biologically programmed to form one primary attachment figure who is qualitatively different and more important than all others. This monotropy creates an internal working model, a cognitive template of relationships that guides all future social and emotional interactions. But here was the problem. Bowlby's theory described what attachment is and why it exists. What it could not tell you was whether attachment quality varies between infants, and if so, how to measure those differences. And that is the gap Ainsworth stepped into. Most people assume Harlow's wire and cloth mother study, by the way, was straightforwardly approved and celebrated at the time. In fact, it was deeply controversial. The conditions the monkeys were kept in were extremely distressing, and the long-term psychological damage to the isolated monkeys was severe. Harlow's work sits at the centre of ongoing debates about animal ethics in psychological research, which are still active today. Mary Ainsworth was born in Glendale, Ohio in 1913 and died in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1999. Her career spanned more than 5 decades and produced what is arguably the single most important observational method in developmental psychology. Here, we trace her career through 3 phases, and each one matters. London. Ainsworth began her collaboration with John Bowlby at the Tavistock Clinic in London. Working directly with Bowlby gave her deep immersion in his theoretical framework. The idea of a primary attachment figure, the internal working model, the biological basis of attachment. But Bowlby's work was largely theoretical and clinical. Ainsworth wanted to observe. Uganda, 1954. Ainsworth spent 2 years in Uganda, Africa, conducting naturalistic home observations of mothers and infants. She visited families in their homes, observing everyday interactions between caregivers and babies over extended periods. This was groundbreaking methodology. Instead of bringing subjects into a laboratory, she went to them in their natural environment. And what she found in Uganda was crucial. She noticed that infants did not all respond to their caregivers in the same way. Some infants use their mothers confidently as a base for exploration. Others seemed anxious and clingy. Some appeared oddly indifferent. And these were not random differences. They seemed to correspond to differences in how responsive and sensitive mothers were to their infants' signals. Ainsworth had identified individual differences in attachment quality for the first time. The question now was, how do we study them systematically? Baltimore, 1963. Back in the United States at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Ainsworth replicated and extended her observations. Again, she found consistent individual differences corresponding to caregiver sensitivity. Now she needed a controlled method, something standardized enough to allow comparison between infants, something that would reliably elicit attachment behaviors in a predictable way. The result was the strange situation. And a specific note here for OCR students studying the child psychology option. The specific study you need to know is cited as Ainsworth and Bell, 1970. Attachment, exploration, and separation, illustrated by the behaviour of 1-year-olds in a strange situation. This is the core study for the development of attachment topic. You need to know the background, the method, the results, and the conclusions in the full detail that OCR's core study format requires. The strange situation is a controlled observation, a structured procedure conducted in a laboratory setting designed to systematically elicit and measure attachment behaviors by introducing mild, carefully calibrated stressors. The setting was a laboratory playroom. An unfamiliar environment stocked with toys observed through a one-way mirror. The unfamiliarity of the setting is itself the first mild stressor. It activates the instance attachment system from the very beginning. The procedure consists of 8 episodes, each lasting approximately 3 minutes. The crucial word here is approximately. If the infant becomes too distressed, at any point an episode can be curtailed. And let me walk you through all 8. Episode 1, the introduction. The mother and infant are introduced to the playroom by the experimenter and left alone. Episode 2, the mother and infant are alone. The infant is free to explore the playroom with the mother present. This establishes the baseline. How does the infant use the mother as a secure base for exploration. Episode 3. Stranger enters the room. An unfamiliar adult enters, sits quietly, then gradually interacts with the mother, and then attempts to interact with the infant. And this measures stranger anxiety. Episode 4. The mother leaves the infant with the stranger. The mother leaves quietly. This is the first separation, measuring separation anxiety and how the infant responds to being alone with a stranger. Episode 5. The first reunion. The mother returns and the stranger leaves. This is the first reunion, arguably the most revealing episode. How does the infant respond to the caregiver's return? Episode 6. The mother leaves the infant alone. The mother leaves the infant completely alone. And this is the most stressful episode, maximum separation anxiety, with no one present to provide comfort. Episode 7. The stranger returns before the mother. Can the stranger provide any comfort? This measures whether the infant's distress is specifically about the absence of the caregiver or simply about being alone. And then the final episode, episode 8, is the second reunion. The mother returns again, and this second reunion allows confirmation of the pattern that's seen in episode 5, which is the first reunion. Now, throughout all 8 episodes, trained observers behind the one-way mirror record 5 specific behaviours that are listed here. Proximity seeking. How much does the infant try to get close to the caregiver? Exploration and play. How freely does the infant explore, and does this change across the episodes? Stranger anxiety. How does the infant respond to the unfamiliar adult? Separation anxiety. How distressed does the infant become when the caregiver leaves the room? And reunion behaviour. How does the infant respond when the caregiver comes back? It's the specific pattern of these 5 behaviours across all 8 episodes that determines the infant's attachment classification. In an exam answer about the strange situation procedure, quite often students frequently describe it too vaguely. So don't just say the mother left and came back. Name the episodes, name the behaviours measured, and describe the procedure as a controlled observation. These details are what separate good answers from basic ones. Approximately 60 to 65% of infants in Ainsworth's original Baltimore sample showed what she classified as type B, secure attachment. This is the most common and developmentally favourable attachment pattern. Let me describe the behaviour pattern across the strange situation episodes. In the presence of the caregiver, the securely attached infant explores freely. They move away from their mother to investigate the toys, but they periodically return to her, checking in, making eye contact, perhaps briefly touching her before moving off again. The caregiver is functioning as a genuine, secure base, a psychological anchor that makes exploration feel safe. When the stranger enters, some wariness. The secure infant may pause their exploration and look towards their mother, but they are reassured by her presence and relatively quickly become comfortable. The stranger anxiety is present but manageable. When the mother leaves, moderate separation distress occurs. The secure infant is visibly upset. They may cry, show clear distress, reduce their exploration. Importantly, this distress is proportionate. It is a normal response to an unusual situation. It's not extreme inconsolability. Then at reunion, this is the positive and settled behaviour. This is the defining feature of secure attachment. The infant seeks contact with the returning caregiver, accepts the comfort offered, and settles relatively quickly. The caregiver's return genuinely regulates the infant's distress. And so here we identify the caregiver's style associated with secure attachment. Consistently sensitive and responsive to infant signals and needs. The caregiver reads the infant's cues accurately and responds appropriately. When the infant is distressed, comfort is available and reliable. The infant has learned through repeated experience that the caregiver can be trusted to meet their needs. And this consistent responsiveness allows the infant to develop confidence. They can explore the world because they know the secure base will be there whenever they need it. Now, securely attached infants show the best outcomes across multiple domains of later development. More positive peer relationships, better emotional regulation, higher self-esteem, and greater resilience in the face of stress. The internal working model formed in secure attachment carries forward as a positive template for all future relationships. Approximately 20 to 25% of infants in Ainsworth's sample showed a type A insecure avoidant attachment. Now, this is the second most common type and superficially the most puzzling, because at first glance, these infants can appear perfectly content. So let me describe the behaviour pattern. In the presence of the caregiver, the avoidant infant explores independently, but with a crucial difference from the secure infant. They rarely reference or check back with the caregiver. The caregiver is present, but the infant doesn't seem to use them as the secure base. When the stranger enters, there's little differentiation. The avoidant infant treats the stranger in much the same way that they treat the caregiver. The specific attachment bond doesn't appear to be activated by the stranger's presence. And when the caregiver leaves, little visible separation distress occurs. The infant continues to play, appears largely untroubled by the departure. And to an observer, this can look a bit like independence or confidence. And then at reunion, the infant avoids or ignores the caregiver. And this is the defining behaviour, and it's striking. When the mother returns, the avoidant infant turns away, ignores her, or actively moves in the opposite direction. There's no proximity seeking, no comfort seeking, no apparent joy at the reunion. So why does this happen? Well, here we explain the mechanism, and it is psychologically sophisticated. The caregiver of an avoidant infant is consistently unresponsive or emotionally unavailable. When this infant displays attachment behaviour, like crying, reaching out, seeking comfort, the caregiver does not respond warmly or reliably. Over repeated experiences, the infant learns that displaying need brings no comfort. Attachment behaviour isn't rewarded. The infant's response then becomes adaptive. They suppress the attachment behaviour entirely. They've learned to manage without it. And the crucial point here, the distress is hidden, not absent. And this is the most important and most frequently omitted point about avoidant attachment. And here it's flagged clearly. The distress is still present, it is hidden, but it's not absent. Remember that. Physiological studies measuring cortisol levels, a biological marker of stress, in type A infants show elevated stress responses during separation that are not visible in their outward behaviour. The infant has learned to suppress the expression of distress, but the internal experience of distress is still occurring. And this is a crucial evaluation and application point. Type A infants are not fine. They've simply learned that showing distress is futile. It doesn't get them anywhere. Approximately 10 to 15% of infants in Ainsworth's sample showed type C, which is insecure resistant attachment, also called anxious ambivalent. This is the least common of the three types, and in many ways the most distressing to observe. Let me describe the behaviour pattern. In the presence of the caregiver, they are reluctant to explore. Even before any separation occurs, the resistant infant stays close to the caregiver. They're unable to use them as a true secure base because they cannot settle enough to feel safe moving away. The attachment system is already activated even without a stressor. When the stranger enters, very strong stranger anxiety occurs. The resistant infant is highly wary of unfamiliar people throughout all of the episodes, more so than either of the other attachment types. When the caregiver leaves, extreme and inconsolable distress occurs. The separation anxiety is intense and overwhelming, and these infants can be very, very difficult to settle. Then at reunion, the defining behaviour of ambivalence occurs. And this is what you must be able to describe precisely for your exam. When the caregiver returns, the resistant infant does two contradictory things simultaneously. They seek contact, often by reaching for the caregiver, wanting to be held. They cry to be picked up, and at the same time, they resist the contact. They push away, arch their back, hit out, squirm to get down. They want the caregiver desperately, and they cannot accept the comfort the caregiver offers. So why does this happen? The caregiver of a resistant infant is inconsistent. Sometimes they're warm, sensitive and responsive, and sometimes they're preoccupied, unresponsive or intrusive. And the infant just cannot predict simply which caregiver they're going to get on a given day. And this unpredictability makes it impossible to develop a settled, confident, internal working model. The infant's solution is to maximize attachment behavior, to keep the attachment system permanently activated, to stay close, to cry loudly, to protest intensely, as a strategy to ensure the caregiver's attention when it is available. The ambivalent reunion behaviour makes complete psychological sense from this perspective. The infant desperately wants comfort and closeness, but they are also angry and uncertain, because experience has taught them that even when the caregiver is present, that presence may be withdrawn at any given moment. Now, students will often confuse in exam these two types, A versus C, type A versus type C, and it happens regularly. Here, the exam technique is being flagged. And this is the clearest way to remember the distinction. Type A suppresses attachment behaviour. The caregiver is unresponsive, so the infant has learned to switch the need off. Type C maximizes attachment behaviour. The caregiver is unpredictable, so the infant keeps need permanently switched on. So type A suppresses and type C maximizes attachment behavior. Two opposite strategies in response to two different kinds of problematic caregiving. Let's evaluate the strange situation, and as always, this needs to go beyond simply listing points to include evidence and explanation. The first strength is the standardized procedure. Every aspect of the strange situation is controlled and identical across administrations. The physical setting, the duration of each episode, the behaviors of the stranger and the experimenter, the sequence of events. This standardization enables direct comparison between infants and allows the procedure to be replicated reliably. High standardization is a mark of good scientific method. The second and most important strength is cross-cultural support, notably from van IJzendoorn and Cronenberg's 1988 meta-analysis. This is your primary evaluative study for this topic, and you need to know it precisely. Van IJzendoorn and Cronenberg analysed 32 separate strange situation studies conducted across 8 countries, including the USA, the UK, Germany, Japan, Israel, China, Sweden, and the Netherlands. The total sample across all studies was nearly 2,000 infants. The headline finding: secure attachment was the most common type in every single culture studied. This cross-cultural universality provides strong support for Bowlby's claim that attachment is a biological phenomenon, something that transcends specific cultural practices and child-rearing norms. However, and this is where the evaluation becomes sophisticated, van IJzendoorn also found significant variation within cultures, and that was often greater than variation between cultures. Japan showed higher rates of insecure resistant attachment. Germany showed higher rates of insecure avoidant. And these cross-cultural differences matter. The strange situation has also been enormously influential. It has generated decades of research into early intervention parenting programs, adoption policy, and clinical treatment of attachment difficulties. A method that has sparked this breadth of application has clearly captured something real and important. The weaknesses are as follows. The primary weakness is low ecological validity. The strange situation is conducted in an artificial laboratory setting that most infants have never encountered. The behaviours elicited may reflect the infants' responses to a novel, mildly stressful environment rather than their typical attachment behaviour. The procedure may not accurately represent how these infants behave in their natural home environment. The second weakness is that it measures one relationship only. The classification an infant receives in the strange situation refers specifically to their attachment to the caregiver present in the procedure. Research has shown that the same infant can show different attachment classifications with different caregivers. Secure with their mother, avoidant with their father, for example. The strange situation does not capture the full complexity of an infant's attachment network. Thirdly, there's a cultural bias. And this criticism is subtle, but it's important. The strange situation was designed and validated in middle-class American samples. The definitions of what constitutes secure, avoidant, and resistant behaviour are reflecting American cultural norms for appropriate infant-caregiver interaction. In Japan, where infants are rarely separated from their mothers in the first year of life, even brief separation in the strange situation produces extreme distress, which gets classified as insecure resistant, even though this may simply reflect the cultural norm of closeness rather than an insecure attachment. And finally, there's ethical concerns. Infants in the strange situation are deliberately distressed. They're separated from their caregiver and left alone or with a stranger. While steps are taken to minimize distress, the procedure can be terminated early, caregivers are always nearby. The deliberate introduction of distress in an infant population does raise genuine ethical questions about participant protection that are particularly sensitive given that infants simply can't consent to this process. Here, I give you 4 specific pieces of exam technique guidance, and I want to develop each one. So how to nail this in the exam? The first is to use Van Eysendorn as evaluative evidence. The formula here that I give you is exactly right. Always name, date, and explain the finding. A complete sentence would be, support for the cross-cultural validity of the strange situation comes from Van Eysendorn and Cronenberg, 1988, whose meta-analysis of 32 strange situation studies across 8 countries found secure attachment to be the most common type in every culture, suggesting the procedure captures a universal phenomenon rather than a culturally specific one. That sentence, delivered accurately, is worth significant AO3 marks on any board. But don't stop there. Add the nuance. However, the same study found considerable variation in the proportions of insecure types across cultures, suggesting that while the broad attachment categories may be universal, the specific distribution of types is influenced by cultural child-rearing practices. That 2-part evaluation, support followed by qualification, is what examiners mean when they ask for a balanced evaluation. 2, link it to the caregiver. This second piece of guidance, always connect attachment type to the caregiver behaviour. It's the chain of explanation which examiners will reward. Secure attachment, sensitive and responsive caregiving. Infant learns caregiver is reliable, confident, exploration. Avoid attachment, consistently unresponsive caregiving. Infant learns attachment behaviour is futile, suppresses need. Resistant attachment, inconsistent caregiving. Infant cannot predict availability, maximizes attachment behaviour. Always complete the chain. Don't just describe the infant's behaviour as secure, avoidant, or resistant, but explain the caregiving context that produced it. Type A versus C. And here I give you the key contrast clearly. Type A avoids reunion. Type C is ambivalent at reunion. The underlying distinction is that A suppresses the attachment behaviour and C maximizes it. 2 opposite strategies in response to 2 different caregiving failures. And the tip that I give you is worth highlighting explicitly here. Never write that one insecure type is better or worse than another. Both type A and type C are forms of insecure attachment. The difference is strategic, not one of severity. And finally, for any question asking you to compare attachment types, here I give you the ideal structure. Behaviour, caregiver style, approximate percentage, outcome. Cover all 4 dimensions for each type and you will have a comprehensive, well-organised answer that addresses what examiners are looking for across all of the exam boards. This is Ainsworth's Strange Situation and the 3 types of attachment fully decoded. In the next video, We stay within attachment and cover Bowlby's monotropic theory and maternal deprivation, the theoretical framework that underpins everything we've covered in this session, and a topic that generates some of the most important and most debated questions in developmental psychology. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you there.